Welcome to SHOWstudio. It's our first roundup for spring summer 15 and we're kicking off obviously with New York, which kicks off the fashion season as a whole. I've got a great set of fashion experts with me who are either at the shows or following the shows very closely and keeping an eye on everything that's been going on in the Big Apple. But before we start sort of dissecting the shows and also some of the subsequent sort of personnel changes that we're seeing, which are quite exciting to discuss, I'll let you guys just introduce yourselves, starting with you.
I'm Scarlett, Kilcooley-O'Halloran, and I'm news editor at Vogue.co.uk.
I'm Tilly Macalister-Smith. I'm the fashion features director at matchesfashion.com.
I'm Alex Fiore, I'm a fashion critic and the fashion editor of The Independent.
What stood out in New York? What was the kind of star show? I'm not going to go to you first, that's because you're just going to talk about Versace and Versus and Italian fashion, which is not the purpose of our New York roundup. So Tilly, what stood out for you in New York?
Well, we were just having a little chat about Thom Browne previous to going live, which was really interesting. I think there was a lot of story in it, and there was a lot of beautiful work. I think it also led into this thing that we started seeing a lot of designers doing these kind of situational shows or off-runway shows. So there was this which was set in a sort of garden environment, and then Ralph Lauren did this sort of great big fancy installation in Central Park, and Gareth Pugh did his sort of dance piece and opening ceremony. Obviously there was the Spike Jones play, and there was a lot more theatre than maybe we'd seen before in that sense, which was kind of surprising. I think you don't necessarily expect that from New York.
And do we like to see it in New York? Because it's interesting you mentioned especially the opening ceremony.
I think we need to see it in New York. I think it needed that excitement, because otherwise it just becomes so sort of runway based, showroom based, and it's very safe. So it's exciting.
Does it ever feel like tagging on the theatre to the fashion though? Is that ever a kind of?
I think when you look at someone like Gareth Pugh, then no. I think it's important to have someone like that there as well, because it's completely contrary to everything else that you see. Sure. And yeah, of course, there's sort of a gimmicky element to it, but I think mostly it felt sort of pretty in keeping and useful.
What do you think, you guys, of the kind of theatre in New York? Because it's interesting that you bring that up straight away, Tilly, because I do think, especially with what we saw at Gareth Pugh, it was such a kind of big thing this season and such a topic of debate. There were so many articles written about presenting fashion. Did you enjoy the theatre? Alex, you're looking through.
Well, no, I mean, with Gareth, the kind of, the sort of odd thing with that was that he did say right at the start that he wasn't going to present his whole collection in New York, and he didn't. I wasn't physically there for the presentation, but I know the lookbook was on the release during Paris Fashion Week. And although you got a sense of kind of the ideas that he was exploring in the silhouettes and the clothes themselves, I think in that case, sort of the event overpowered it in a way. And I think the event overpowered it because from the outset he was like, well, actually I'm not showing my clothes.
And
then
said it was supposed to be about
slightly
clothes.
In that way I'm like, so what's the point? If I'm not seeing a collection, if I'm not actually seeing, if this isn't really your statement of garments, if I'm not seeing the physical garments that you're creating, why stage this? Why stage it if you're not going to show everything, and why not show everything? But I guess that's more interesting. Why didn't you show us everything? Because surely it should all feed together. And I think actually it's an incredibly strong collection, and
it's a beautiful collection.
It's the collection I've liked the most since he left London, to be completely honest. I feel like it took us somewhere new. It was really exciting, it was really interesting to see him playing with those things, and I feel like he's been in a bit of a rut for a while in terms of satisfying commercial demands, because obviously when he was in London that wasn't a consideration whatsoever, but moving to Paris and having a larger infrastructure behind him, now he's much more aware of the need for these clothes to have an actual afterlife after the show.
Is that not quite the intriguing thing about them doing this big show that is about theatre and putting forward a statement? And then I quite liked that notion of delay, waiting to
and
see
also
it.
that it wasn't just about the clothes. You know, his thing isn't about being a commercial designer, so I think it's absolutely sort of, you know, warranted for him to present in this way, to give a taster of it, and to sort of introduce, you know, some of the artistic thinking behind it as well. And to see that positioned in New York rather than to have this shown in Paris in this way is interesting against that sort of landscape of so many sort of commercially driven sportswear, you know, contemporary designers.
But I think as well, when you break the sort of boundary in the sort of sphere that you're used to working in and doing, when you do something a little bit more experimental, it does show people your brand in a totally different way.
Yeah.
And like you say, this was your favourite collection of his most recently. Maybe that was because he sort of approached it in a more sort of theatrical, dramatic way. Because like last season with Rick Owens, when he brought that big dance troupe out, it was just, it made you just look at his clothes in a totally different way than we were used to, which was quite urban, quite sort of, I suppose in a way, just quite samey. And it shook things up. So I think it gives also it that element.
Sorry, Scarlett. No, there's obviously been so much chat in recent seasons about the need for the catwalk experience, and with everything going digital, what do you really get out of seeing the clothes? And when you have a sort of an edited artistic sort of introduction to a collection like this, then it does become quite impactful, and it makes you realise that you need to keep that experience or to develop it into another way of showing.
Yeah, it's the clothes in situ as well.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by a comment you just made, because it's interesting. I wonder, would it have been your favourite collection, do you think, if you'd have seen it walking down a runway? Do you think it was part of it?
No,
do you think so?
I actually didn't particularly like what he did in New York. It became my favourite collection when I physically saw the clothes in the lookbooks that he shot in Paris. You know, I thought it looked incredibly strong and felt very different. I actually felt like an evolution. It felt like a jolt that I'd been waiting a long time for him to do.
Yeah.
And when I looked at it, I thought, wouldn't it have been amazing if, and I loathe dance and fashion, as many people know, wouldn't it have been amazing if the dancers were wearing this? Wouldn't people wearing this, doing that, have looked incredible? And I feel like I lost that. It felt a little bit...
He won you round to dance.
But sometimes I think with people being very theatrical, it can feel a little bit like The Wizard of Oz. It's a bit, you know, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, and the man behind the curtain being the clothes, like, oh, I'm not terribly confident about what I'm doing. Let's stage something really big and kind of bamboozle you all with it. And I think conversely, really, when you're staging something enormous, the clothes have to be very strong to stand up to it, or else they will get swamped. And it was something that was even, you know, levelled at John Galliano in the 90s, and sometimes at Alexander McQueen, that the shows could overwhelm the clothes. So, and I think if it's been levelled at those two people, it's something that people have got to watch.
Do you think it was kind of the season in New York where it was, as Tilly was kind of implying earlier, and very astutely, it kind of did feel like it was the season that was about redefining the show rather than redefining the clothes? That's what I definitely felt.
I don't know if it was necessarily that. There was only sort of junctures throughout the week where you sort of noticed that. It's just that they were so unusual to be happening that you sort of picked up on them. But I don't think it was any more than that necessarily. It didn't feel like there was groundbreaking conceptual sort of shows.
But I think as well, it's when you talk about the people that did it. You know, Gareth is a very conceptual designer, but it was Polo Ralph Lauren, and it was Opening Ceremony that are very much that kind of preppy American sportswear, and it's almost like, so what can we do to make this seem new?
Do you think it felt tagged on, that kind of...
Well, I feel like it's what can we do to make this feel fresh?
Yeah.
And to get it spoken about.
I mean, personally, I'd rather that people were addressing making something that felt fresh in the clothing rather than something that felt fresh in the presentation. But at the same time, those brands are New York brands. They're kind of the epitome of that very commercial approach that a lot of brands have, and not only in New York, but I feel like New York as kind of this foundation of American sportswear and of, you know, industrialized ready-to-wear, kind of around emerging in the interwar period. I think it's very much what American fashion kind of stands for a lot of people, which I actually think is unfair. Someone was asking me, you know, do you like American designers? Don't you think there aren't any great American designers? I'm like, there's so many. You know, Stephen Sprouse, Jeffrey Bean, Giorgio Di Sant'Angelo, Holston. You know, you go back and there's this enormous wealth of amazing American design.
Which I think is being really referenced at the moment. I do feel like that's kind of I think, was I talking to you about this? Just even in that Marc Jacobs collection that was kind of not the one we just saw, the previous, which was this kind of idea of that kind of
that was very American sportswear.
And I feel like there's...
And Tom Ford doing the Jeffrey Bean dress.
Exactly.
You know, there are certain people reclaiming it. It's quite nice that it's American designers reclaiming kind of American greats.
Their heritage, it's interesting. I find that quite intriguing. It's interesting to talk about this idea of kind of, you talk about kind of to get talked about, it's quite important to use a show, because I'm just interested if you, when you're kind of, because I know when you're at the shows and you're doing kind of coverage for MatchesFashion.com or for Vogue, do you find that there's this kind of focus, if you put up a picture of a great presentation, it will do better than if you put up a kind of a close-up of a dress? Do people tend to engage with that more?
I think people engage with quality online. Like if we put up a quick image of something that's walked past us on the catwalk, I mean, with the age of technology, everyone can do it, and there's lots of things out at the shows. So what our readers certainly engage with a lot more is quality and like a beautiful close-up of a detail, or, you know, like a big dress at the end.
Or also that kind of behind the scenes thing, or if you're in a showroom or meeting with the designers or backstage, and actually that's that's kind of the most enjoyable part of being at the shows, is not just seeing the runway stuff, but going to the showroom, seeing the clothes again, like you were saying at Proenza, being talked through the collection in that kind of detail, and you start to understand it in a different way.
But do you think digital has ever made people a little bit numb to kind of subtlety? It's got to be, as you say, like an amazing kind of like detail, some great beading, a big dress, huge presentation. If it was just like a really great cut piece of tailoring, I find it quite interesting the kind of you know, the
I think certain things pop better digitally, you know, and you can see that with street style and, you know, all sorts of, you know, accessories designers that are popping up and positioning their brand with those kinds of editors, because they know that they're going to be photographed, and, you know, it's enough to launch a brand. It can be.
It's just, it makes me a bit sad sometimes, because I kind of love that idea of kind of this perfect, beautifully crafted garment, and they kind of get ignored. And I was thinking a lot this season about the looks that come to symbolise a collection based on what was Instagrammed the most, and often it's kind of like the anomaly looks.
At the same time, it's you know, a beautiful piece of tailoring doesn't. It's actually something that should be enjoyed physically. I think there is this idea of, you know, for instance, the way that Celine don't sell anything online. I think that's because Phoebe wants people to go out and engage with the garment. She wants people to go out and try it on and physically handle it and comprehend why, you know, why it's fantastic, why it costs so much, you know,
to have that comprehend what experience, and
which I think it's interesting to think about it in two very different ways. I was talking with J.W. Anderson, and he said, you know, he was thinking about digital and how things register digitally, and that almost when you see a garment, because you get bored of it having seen it online, when you see it in a shop, it almost has to be a completely different thing. And I think that's almost what designers are grappling with, clever designers are grappling with at the moment, is that idea of, so how do we have a digital experience of this garment that can satisfy you immediately, and then how can we hook you again when you actually see it in a shop?
And with Jonathan, I know we're talking about New York, but just he said he deliberately thought about what he put down the catwalk in terms of he only wanted to show teasers, and he'd only want to show the hint of an idea, not the full-on idea, because even some of the most sort of experimental pieces of what would just be seen in the showroom or would just go on the shop floor at the point of sale, because he doesn't want it to have that feeling of overkill by the time it gets to that sort of stage in the retail calendar.
It's interesting because the design that kind of you guys kept sort of briefly kind of mentioning Proenza and what they did this season. I feel like they get that balance really, really well between stuff that has interesting digital sort of impact, but there's always something more in the touch. And you were saying that you enjoyed this show. Was this something?
No, it wasn't my favourite Proenza. I think they've been a bit more innovative before this season. But I mean, I didn't actually see the collection in person, and Alex was saying that when you actually saw the garments, it was how they were made, and it was
it's interesting
craftsmanship that was the most impressive.
They said to me, because I wasn't in New York for the show, but I went to preview it with them the day before, and they said, we were thinking about boring clothes. We want it to be boring. They were like, it's boring American sportswear. They're like, it's the dumb clothes we all wear every day, and it's what we can do with that.
Definitely
so,
wearable.
You know, there's things that kind of look like nylon, but they're leather, and it's perforated leather. It's very thin leather. There's a skirt that looks like it's a skirt and a vest, I think, that look like almost like denim, like blown up denim, but it's leather that somebody spent the whole of August braiding, and when you look at the inside, it's like a denim weave. So there's like a kind of twill on the inside and a herringbone on the outside.
That's a perfect example of what we just said. Like, you saw it up front and you saw a garment, and I didn't. So my perspective on this show is so different.
I saw it on the catwalk and then in the showroom in Paris, and that idea of sort of slightly boring sportswear is precisely what I got from it. But then you see something like that polo shirt there on the left, and it's the most beautiful, like, hand weave and crochet, like the workmanship that goes into those pieces is not something that you can glean from, you know, sort of 12 minutes.
And it is that interesting idea of stuff that is kind of an exciting experience for not just the person that sees it in the showroom, but for the eventual wearer. This idea that, you know, the inside is very beautiful. I think that's quite an interesting idea.
That's why people will spend the kind of price points that clothes like this demand as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Why is everyone being so boring at the moment? Why is it kind of like the age of ordinary?
I don't think it necessarily is, but I think a lot of people are retrenching themselves, and it felt like this season, for me, certainly was very much about people trying to reaffirm what it is they actually mean. You look at something like Altazara, which I was quite disappointed with, and I've said this to him, so I can talk about it. And I was disappointed because it felt like it was Altazara doing Altazara. It was him really kind of doing pieces that he knew people had reacted to really well previously. And I like Altazara when he's perverse and when he's uncomfortable and when he's really experimenting and when he's doing things that might fall flat on their face.
Yeah.
It felt like this was much more kind of playing to the crowd. This was very much about, well, you know, I know this skirt works, and I know this, you know, I know this jacket works. I know this will all work together. Which is, maybe it's connected to the Target thing that he did about examining his own back catalogue, and trying to really reaffirm what his brand stands for, especially since he's had the investment and all of those kind of things. But I think Altazara is one of the few labels in New York where you go to and expect a jolt of something new. You expect it to, not necessarily to change the course of fashion, but you expect it to kind of change his course. You expect him to show you something different that may very well be picked up later on. And really this felt like it was about him kind of just reiterating what he stands for.
It's very interesting to draw a parallel there, isn't it, to Christopher Kane and what he did with this notion of kind of going back to ideas that he once had. I know it's a slightly different thing, but I think it is interesting that we saw a lot of that this season, not just going through their... actually you're right, just going through their own archive, going through their own back history of whether it's actual physical pieces or ideas, and I wonder why that feels like a thing.
Well, it was definitely an idea that seemed to start in New York, and then you saw it in every other city, and like you say, Altazara being Altazara, every designer just seemed to be that version of themselves. Proenza looked just like Proenza, and maybe a bit of Proenza that you've seen before. With a lot of London designers, you got that sense that they were, exactly serving up a recipe that they knew would work, and actually you'd like Proenza to just go and do something maybe extraordinary, pretty and soft because it would be surprising, but to do it in their way. And it didn't feel like there was a lot of newness in that sense of people really sort of changing.
Is that because of the financial climate?
I wonder if it's something to do with pre-collections, because the spring-summer season used to be the long season, and now it's actually the short season because a resort collection is kind of demanded of people now. Some people can get away with not doing a pre-fall collection, but people are really demanding a pre-spring collection now. And so it's become, rather than this long uninterrupted stretch, it's become you've got to deliver something in June, July, and then Italy closes in August, which really affects what people can do in terms of fabric. With Proenza, when they showed me that braided leather, because we were talking about kind of, I was like, so what have you been able to do? And they're like, well, we did this because we didn't have to do this in Italy. We had this braided, and they were like, so we've done all this kind of stuff that we could do in the studio because we can't, and it's suede that we've crocheted because we can do that in the studio. We can't develop any fabrics, and I think that's a real, and it affects even people like, I was talking to Donatella Versace, and she's like, my factory closes. She's like, it's my factory, but they close for August. I can't do anything about it. She's like, I'd love it if they didn't, but they close for August.
I'm sure she can do something about it if she really wants
to. No, because it's ingrained. That's when people go on holiday. And even if your factory was open, the fabric people won't be open. And these people won't be open. It's something that is kind of set in stone. And I think it's with these interseasonal collections and the increasing importance and the creative demands of them now, I think Nicolas Guesquier's resort collection for Louis Vuitton, I think, for me, was really it was a collection. It wasn't a resort collection. It wasn't a pre-collection. It was this enormous statement of this has to be as good as anything you show in Paris or anything you show in New York or London or
But they do now, because the return on investment for the designers is that they're on those clothes are on the shop floor for a lot longer than the summer collections.
And they're being shot as well.
They're being photographed, exactly. And the resort collections, going back to your point, Lou, were much more trend driven than the spring summer main collections felt actually. And if all the creative energy is going into those collections beforehand, you sort of wonder. Now that the catwalk collections are becoming like a watered down version of them rather than those being a teaser into the main event.
Yeah, it's really all become a bit confused and odd, hasn't it? I wonder, do you find it with the Vogue reader, is there a kind of, because interesting, we talked about kind of getting shot, and I think there is, and we are seeing kind of proper shows now. And is there an enthusiasm for the reader to know about that, or would you always get sort of more interest, better hits on the big two?
No, definitely. I mean, Pre comes out, and I mean, we run full galleries on Pre collections now that get, you know, not just as many hits, but definitely get interest. Yeah, and I think as well it's about the speed of how we work these days. Like, people want to see the latest thing all the time. They want to see the newest and the latest, and you know, they want to be pinning and they want to be liking and they want to be informed about everything. So, and I think that speed directly relates to, you know, this maybe collections appearing quite similar and there being a common thread because of that demand and that speed that designers feel, and it has this sort of trickle-down effect of the people that report on it. It's just this relentless kind of reportage and creation and everything, if that makes sense. So I think there's definitely an appetite for it.
It is odd that we prioritise the analysis, though, of spring, summer, autumn, winter, because there is definitely. It's interesting what you say about doing kind of full galleries, which, you know, we see a lot of, but there's still this kind of the majority of analysis is on autumn, winter. Is that going to change?
I suppose it's about time as well, and how many people can be in one place or in lots of different places at the same time.
Yeah. I think one of the things as well that I've noticed, probably moving from Vogue to you know, a business that's attached to a retail company, is that you get a lot of information about what people are buying when, and it's starting to become much more trans-seasonal, and it's a big talking point within the business, is that actually now when you're talking to a global customer or global reader, they are travelling from sun to snow to sun to snow, and it does within the same month, and it doesn't matter that, you know, you also see it on the catwalk as well, whereas there's been increasingly a lot more black coming through in summer collections. There's a lot more sort of layering. There's those pieces that work sort of trans-seasonally, I think.
It's interesting, isn't it, to that extent, where I wonder if we'll get to a point where fashion critics, fashion journalists are operating in a sense where they're reporting constantly, but also quite generally, where they're kind of making parallels between pre and
I can't remember the last time I saw a trend that I thought, that's worth throwing my whole wardrobe away for. I want to reinvent myself into that woman. And I think that idea has kind of slowly dissolved, and we've become quite open to everything, but consequently it means that you do get a slightly softer interpretation of trends. I think, you know, when you're putting together the trend report at Vogue, it becomes less hard-lined between, you know, it could be a bit military, it could be a bit 70s, it could be a bit bohemian, that, you know, everything sort of blurs a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I think there were some definite trends to pull out of New York this season. I suppose the 70s thing started there. There was a lot of gingham as well, and there were a lot of, you know, blown up florals and that sort of, and that is kind of harking back.
Why was the 70s so in the air? Because it was kind of, by the end, I was like...
Resort as well, yeah. I guess it's some sort of
cyclical
inkling for, you know, a time, a bygone era. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of quite free.
Nostalgic age as well.
Yeah, and there was all sorts of, you know, interpretations of that woman, from the sort of, you know, obviously that Studio 54, quite disco, you know, to Valentino kind of rainbow stripes that we saw on Pre, and now it's becoming a much more kind of bohemian hippie type of, like, a bit later in the decade kind of 70s girl. So it's I think there's an interpretation of her that speaks to everybody, really.
I mean, I was very cynical, and I just thought, well, 70s, it's the easy sell. It's easier than the 60s. It's
Totally.
Easier than the 80s. It's easier than the 50s, and those are the decades that fashion references. And out of all of them, the 70s is the easiest one to sell. And also, it's got wide trousers, and we've not seen wide trousers for a bit. So that's really cynically. I think it's very true. It's like shoulder pads are difficult to sell. You know, cinched in waist are difficult to sell.
In that 60s thing we had a few seasons ago. The 90s.
Yeah. That's interesting. But why is that, you say easy to sell, and I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at in terms of, like, have we just got to a point where fashion is so focused on selling? Because this back to this idea of people kind of doing their doing themselves, and you pointed out the kind of the influence and the impact of Cruise and Pre on that, but are we always going to see this kind of playing safe attitude?
But I don't think, I mean, for me, I don't think something being saleable necessarily means that it's playing safe. For instance, if we looked at Versus Versace, which we did straight after the show, I don't think that looks like an easy sell at all.
Sold so you guys had it on matches straight from
it's
the,
like
yeah,
I think
exactly.
there were at least 3 styles that sold out in a day or
launch.
something.
Yeah.
With you guys.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think and actually again it's that thing we were saying about designers reiterating what they're really about. I think the really great thing, and actually the really commercial thing about this, was that it was really uncompromising and really specific to it's totally Versace. And if you want to buy Versace, you'll buy this, and if you don't, you'll go somewhere else. But it was very targeted.
Versace.
Yeah.
It was so brilliant, and it was kind of in a weird way quite refreshing to be so Versace, to be almost the expected becoming the unexpected in a way.
Well, and do you think part of that was because it was in New York, so there was kind of a license to be even more Versace and even more Italian?
But I think as well it's because it's Anthony Vaccarello who uses Versace as a reference and is young, and it's
so naturally going to be a pastiche in a kind of interesting
but it's
way
that fresh, it's that also that kind of Chinese whispers thing of remembering, kind of half remembering Liz Hurley's dress fastened with safety pins, and when you go and look at it, it's not particularly amazing, but the memory of it in your mind is, oh my god, it's so incredible.
Well, it signifies
and it looks
so
like
much,
this,
doesn't it? Yeah.
And I think with this, I think for me it just felt like it was 29 versions of Liz Hurley's dress, which was really I just felt it was really kind of great and joyous and very having a great time going through the archive, having a great time kind of rejuvenating it and really looking at what the sort of building blocks of Versace are, and I think in a weird way also wanting people to buy it and wanting people to wear it, and that isn't a dirty thing. And it doesn't mean that you can't be creative actually. If something's really, really fantastic and you absolutely have to own it, then that's really commercial, I think. The fact that something is just so great that you have to go out and buy it straight away.
That is definitely the appeal of these clothes, I think, because you say that it didn't look like an easy sell necessarily because it was so creative, but I disagree. I don't know a woman that wouldn't want to look that sexy and that kind of like vivacious and full of kind of, verve for it. I certainly would, but if there was a collection that was, it's the flat shoe, it's the difficult skirt length, I don't think that has that kind of, that grabbiness.
You must go and get it.
It was clever to show that in New York as well, because I sort of feel like it would have been lost had they shown in Milan. Because of the prints, it would have just kind of fallen in with every other, with Pucci and with Versace itself. Like being in New York, it was just like, it stood out. It was one of the real standout shows. I think for everyone, whether you like it, whether you don't, whether you would wear it or not, it was everyone remembered it.
It's interesting, this notion of kind of like being a bit of a tourist and showing in different places, and I wonder if we will see more of that, because it's interesting what you just said there. I do think for some brands it's actually a really smart move. They can make much more of an impact by going to a different city, and also we always talk about fashion being more global and how the 4 cities are breaking down, so it's quite intriguing that we think it's quite surprising for a brand to go show in a different city.
When I was interning with Jonathan Saunders, he went to show in New York for a couple of seasons, and I remember he said that it teaches you to show in a different way. The level of polish and perfection, and it's a different industry than it is, in London, and it puts you on the map in a different way, but it also teaches you how it should be done. And I think if you grow up in the culture of London, where it's sort of done in a different way. It's not a worse way, but I think it can educate a brand into how to think a bit more globally. For example.
Well, it's interesting. It's so important now, and I wonder. I don't know. I didn't look at this collection necessarily think that this one was more global, but it did feel like it just had a kind of a more of a sense of what Versus is about and seeing it in a difference.
Well, I guess also it's so Italian, and to sort of transport that to somewhere else, it brings you back to this idea of kind of localized community, where everything's becoming so homogenized and digital and available and global. It's quite nice to start rooting things in their own sort of geography in a way. I suppose. And
confident as well to do an all black, like very, very high wattage, sexy collection for summer. And to sort of show, I mean, that could equally have been done in white, and it would have had, I think, less impact. I mean, there were white pieces for sure, but it was just had such impact.
Was black, And tell me, on matches, did it do incredibly well? Was the audience very global? Did you find you had more American sales, more Italian sales? How did it work?
I actually don't know where the sales were, but it did do incredibly well, and I think it's also because they're very smart in tapping into. They did a huge global launch. So what happened was, after the show there was a party, and then globally it went online to be sold around the world at the same time. And I think the kind of person that's going to be buying this is the kind of person that is keyed into that kind of marketing approach. It's very smart. You wouldn't necessarily see Oscar de la Renta having the same kind of concept. And so I think it was responded to very well because of the people that were looking at it, and they're already engaged. You've got a captive audience.
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it, to think about these ideas of being. It kind of goes back to what Alex was saying, the idea of being commercially smart and commercially creative alongside creatively creative, if that makes sense. And I find that quite interesting this season. It felt like that's where a lot of the creativity came. It was in the commercial.
But I think in a weird way, we started off talking about Thom Browne, and to assert something quite controversial, I think Thom Browne's an incredibly commercial designer, because I think the way that I kind of think that Thom Browne is a bit like kind of a fashion Quaker or something. It's like once you start to wear it, there are so many people that only wear Thom Browne, and it's this amazing universe, and it's really like, it's not like anything I've ever seen before.
Does that mean it's a cult?
But I think it is incredibly commercial, because this looks like a really extreme vision, but this will actually sell to certain people. And at the same time, it's easily boiled down to, to things that people will wear, to that grey suit that so many men own, to the t-shirts with the loop on the back, and they are kind of buying into this brand. And it's really, I find it quite incredible what he's done, and the fact that he can stage shows like this that are, I mean, the amount of work, it's something like 20% of that collection is mink, is pieced together, dyed, shaved mink in a summer collection. But no, I love the amount of work that's gone into it. When things were going past, you would suddenly see that it was all, it was completely embroidered in like matte sequins, or just the amount of kind of time and effort that went into this, I think is quite extraordinary.
Do you think it's also down to the role of the stylist as well, that designers are working with? Does that sort of play an increasing part? I mean, like you were saying, you could pull away that jacket and you could have, the dress as a dress by itself, but to put that vision together, it looks incredibly challenging.
I don't know if Tom works with a stylist. I know there are still some designers that don't, which I think is very interesting. And for me, a lot of the very persuasive designers don't work with a stylist. For instance, Medium Kirchhoff don't work with a stylist.
Even Christopher Shannon.
Yeah, exactly. I think, there are certain people that are very assured in what they do, although I do think a stylist being involved can give it I think maybe a stylist being involved can sometimes make things into more of a separate collection, can make things more easily pulled apart, whereas a designer can be very fixated. Well, it depends if you want a fresh eye or not. It's interesting, this idea of having impact with your collection, and you use the word persuasive then, which I think is very interesting, because if you bring a stylist and you are naturally asking someone to kind of slightly filter your vision, to interpret it in a different way, and I think some people are open to that, and sometimes I think that can make it better, because people can come in and be like, well, this should be a jacket, or that this should be a jacket and a skirt and not a dress, or this should, and I think that kind of interpretation can help some designers, but then I think with certain designers, they're just dead set on exactly what they want to do. And it's not to say that one approach is better than the other, or that one approach is right and one approach is wrong. I think it's different approaches, but they bring different things to the table, and people approach things in different ways.
And the same with sort of, I suppose, commercial directors at the big conglomerates that a lot of the designers are now working with, who will come in and say, actually, you haven't got one pair of trousers in your lay plan, that's not going to do for us. So, that sort of becomes where, you have to start not churning out by any stretch, but addressing different constraints, I suppose.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, isn't it, that role of a stylist? I don't think it's something, I know we always talk about being kind of in the age of the super stylist and how stylists have kind of appeared and now credited everywhere, but I do feel the role that stylists have in shows is perhaps not discussed that extensively. I wonder if kind of, sometimes I think whether our viewers would know that much about it or be
But
that
I think also it varies from show to show. There are stylists that operate as creative directors and work with designers from grassroots level, and there are stylists that come in and
2 days before and
they construct it as a look and basically what their job is. And there are some stylists that come in and really the designer has a very specific idea of exactly what they want to do, and the stylist is about offering options for hair and makeup, maybe suggesting changing a shoe. And there are single stylists that do all of those with different labels. So I think actually it's very interesting, and for me it comes back to the designer as the real catalyst and as the engine, and it's how the designer wants to work with that stylist. That's and how that relationship works and how that builds, because you know sometimes it's a creative collaboration and sometimes they're a member of the team to help you achieve what you want to achieve. And it's not about you two, it's about this team helping this one person achieve what they want.
Did you make the Jeremy Scott show?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
I didn't go to Jeremy Scott.
What do we think of Jeremy Scott?
He does what he does. You know, I was looking into his back catalogue recently, and what he's doing now for Moschino, he's been doing since 2006 with Snickers sweaters and things like that. And when you look back at him, you have to admire him as a brand and sort of sticking to his guns in what is, as we've just discussed, an industry that does put pressure on for saleability and for commercialism and things like that. So he's not everyone's cup of tea for sure, but.
Why do you think he's kind of riling people at the moment? Do you think it is mainly the Moschino thing? Because it's interesting what you said there, that what he's doing, he's done for a while, because I completely agree, and it's kind of interesting, this kind of new sense of like outrage at what he's doing, and maybe it is because it's under the name of Moschino, but I don't think there's that much newness to what he's doing. It's very him.
Yeah, it's exhibitionist, you know, it's look at me, and it's loud, and obviously for this one he collaborated with Miley Cyrus, which just added that extra element of, you know, tabloid, I suppose, inches to what he did.
Yeah.
I guess it's poking fun as well, isn't it? And I think a lot of people take this industry extremely seriously, and it could be, you know, sort of quite a seen as quite a slur on the industry to be to be having sort of.
It's quite interesting because when you see him interviewed, he does kind of like reject that idea a little bit. He's like, you know, I'm not just having a laugh. Like I do have these very serious ideas.
Everything's very considered. He's compared himself to Andy Warhol and sort of the whole pop culture thing.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? What's your take on Alex, even though you didn't make the show?
I don't have an opinion on Jeremy Scott.
You must have an opinion on Jeremy Scott. That's a ridiculous thing to say.
I don't have an opinion on Jeremy Scott.
You just don't like it?
Don't have an opinion on it.
Pleading the fifth.
Doesn't register on my radar.
It's not fashion.
It's not fashion.
Do you not think it's fashion?
I'm just confusing him with words.
Okay. It's not something I would look at. Why would I bother looking at it? It's not going to change anything. It's not important. I wouldn't bother looking at it.
But you say it's not important, but then it is kind of important in the sense that lots of people are talking about fashion because of it. Do you not see an importance in that?
No, not really.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's unfair to dismiss it like that. I mean, it is what it is. There's plenty of brands. I think I would be more interested in seeing Jeremy Scott, what he put out on the runway, than I would to look at Polo Ralph Lauren, which was just like classic American girl in Paris, as it always is. I mean, like I say, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think you can't dismiss it.
Yeah, I almost do feel like you can't ignore it, and I don't mean that's just because it's so out there, but I just mean it is having a big impact on...
One way or another. It's like the Kardashians. You can't ignore them. When they get to a certain point, you know, they were a family that were very much boxed, you know, to begin with, but it gets to a certain point when they're on the cover of Vogue, and
the Kardashians have been like the stars of these panels. We've talked about them so much this season. I really feel it's crazy.
But there comes a point with everything
that's
undeniable. You know, you have to at least acknowledge that something exists.
I acknowledge it exists, but I don't think it's important.
Do you not though? Do you not think that when something has big impact like that on like culture?
I don't think it has a big impact on culture.
Do you not? Even to have someone like Miley Cyrus involved, I know like it or not, but
that doesn't. It's not fashion. It doesn't impact fashion to me.
Is that just Jeremy Scott or Moschino as well?
That's Jeremy Scott specifically. I have an issue with what he does at Moschino.
Just because you think it's disrespectful to the house?
I don't think it's not an interesting, relevant form of fashion. I think it's restating things that have been stated. I think it's infantile, and I don't think it's intelligent. I like intelligent fashion. I like fashion that is proposing something new and something different. I like fashion that actually wants to take you some places. I don't like fashion that just wants to hawk something. I don't like somebody that's just out to make a quick buck. That's what I don't like in fashion.
But it's interesting when you say the word fashion, and it's a question that's kind of, I'm interested to hear what you all think in a sense, because one thing that I find interesting about what he does, and especially this season because of the Miley Cyrus thing, is, as you mentioned, where I feel like this is probably one of the collections that if you look at an audience outside of fashion, just an audience that kind of is interested in pop culture or kind of entertainment, they would probably know more about this show than many of the other ones. And it's interesting when something becomes kind of bigger than fashion. As you said, it's not fashion, but I think a lot of people would look at this and say this was fashion because it's one of the only shows they saw.
But I think it's really sad that you just tag Miley Cyrus onto something and then everybody knows. Like you tag a Kardashian onto something and everybody knows about it. I think that's really sad.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what fashion should be. Fashion should be about people doing extraordinary things. The reason everybody knows about Alexander McQueen
is because he was extraordinary.
Is because he was extraordinary. And I mean, now it's been overshadowed, but hopefully not for much longer. The reason everybody used to know John Galliano was because he did extraordinary things. And I think actually I come from a point where when I first started to get interested in fashion in the 90s, it was the people doing extraordinary things that were on GMTV News. And that, you know, like Gaultier doing his first couture, McQueen doing his first couture at Givenchy, John moving to Dior. I thought, you know, that was really wonderful. And I really hate the dumbing down of fashion.
Yeah,
the general dumbing down, Gokwanization of fashion, just appealing to the lowest common denominator by just using people that everybody knows. And that people will talk about shows and we'll talk about who went to the show and not talk about the clothes. I don't care who's watching. I don't care who's watching it. I don't care who's wearing it. I don't look above the neck unless they're wearing a hat, which is what I always say. It's like, you know, it's about the clothes. That's what it should be. And that's what should be moving things on. It should be the clothes.
But I guess that's a point about how, you know, the landscape's changed generally and culturally since then, because, you know, when we were growing up and first watching fashion TV, and Miley Cyrus didn't exist, Big Brother hadn't happened yet, you know, and culturally there was this kind of dirge of sort of C-list celebrities wasn't really there. There was Liz Hurley wearing Versace, but that was different. That was
but I think there have been examples, because, you know, there was Madonna in Gaultier shows and things like that, and Bjork in a Gaultier show, you know, but it didn't become the thing. People talked about the clothes, and the person being in the show did make a difference, but it was part of a bigger statement. It wasn't just the statement. And I think that's my issue with this specifically, is that's the statement. That was the only important thing.
Yeah, I don't think that argument's limited to fashion now. I think that is...
No, it's very much pop culture.
Yeah, and it's like with the advent of social media and everything. I mean, it's sort of all who you are, and everyone's a brand, and you know, everyone's got their Instagram page and their Twitter.
And it is this whole thing, which is, you know, and you know it working on a newspaper because you appeal to I think it's fair to say you appeal to a broader audience than perhaps Vogue, which is much more specific to, you know, you're appealing to a very fashion educated audience. But with us, if the fashion department writes about any, you know, if we mention Miley Cyrus, that will be the thing that will get the most people will come to see that on the website. And it's a little bit, I understand why, because more people are searching for Miley Cyrus than are searching for Raf Simons.
But the worry is you kind of feed that, especially with digital journalism.
Exactly. Yeah. That's always the concern, is that, really, and also that designers feed that because they know, well, this will end up so many more places. And if this person's there, if this person's wearing it, if this person's in the show.
I wonder if Savage Beauty will be a kind of actually, palette cleanse is probably the wrong word, or a kind of maybe like a pleasant kind of reminder of how different things can be. It's interesting that it's going to be in London. I wonder if people will go and see that and see the amazing job that Sam Gainsbory's going to do in kind of making it feel like being at the show. Yeah, it did, didn't it?
The other morning at the the preview, it really felt like, God, we haven't seen anything like this for so long. It was so important, and to have Claire Wilcox introducing it in that way, you get all those feelings back of, like you said, when you first started becoming interested in fashion, it was because of the clothes, because of people like McQueen.
But it's interesting, isn't it? It comes at a time where, you know, the British Fashion Council are encouraging London designers to have like Instagrammable moments at their shows, and there's a kind of an irony, because McQueen probably had more Instagrammable moments than any other designer will ever do, but he did it in a very authentic way. And it's interesting now, I sometimes wonder this, and you're going to get angry at me, Alex, but I sometimes wonder if McQueen was showing now and showing in the way he did, whether people would dismiss it as kind of Instagram fodder, because we're so acclimatised to seeing people doing kind of
I don't think so, because the clothes were always great, and that's the thing.
Is that going
because
back to Tom Brown?
Because I wrote about the shows for the V-Next catalogue, and one of the points I made was he could do this because the clothes justified it. And I think personally, the funny thing with Tom Brown is Tom Brown showed on the top floor of a building. You had to walk up lots of stairs to get there. through a very narrow staircase. We all got up there. We were all worried about how long it's going to take. You get very angry when being able
to go up high for shows.
Well, I get very angry when you're isolated in a room with 600 people with a very small exit. I get quite anxious about that because 600 people are all going to try and get through that door at the same time.
I once got stuck with Alex in a lift going, was it a Fendi show? It was like really high up. And
that was horrendous.
And he went mental.
But anyway, so we'd gone up, we were all sat there, and there was anxiety and people were a bit pissed off, and then it started and you were just absolutely lifted. And even people that were there that we were talking about and they were very much like, it's the first Tom Brown show I've been to, I'm really not convinced of this. Afterwards they were just like, that was wonderful. And it really, really was a wonderful
innovation
show.
Like if McQueen was still showing, he was an innovator, and so he would probably, who knows, like he might have banned an audience, or do you know what I mean, turned the concept of a show completely on its head. So I think it's about how innovative you can be, and like you were saying, Tom Brown did something that surprised, and I think when brands do that, that's what's impressive. And, you know, clearly
there's a lot we haven't talked about. We haven't talked at all about Marc by Marc or Marc Jacobs. Let's start with Marc by Marc. What did you guys think? Because there's so much talk and excitement around what Katie, Leah and Luella are doing at the moment. Sorry, can we go Marc by Marc? Yeah, thank you. Not that.
It was so loud.
Was it?
It was
our eardrums were bleeding. It was great.
I loved how loud it was.
Yeah.
But it really made a point.
It definitely made a point.
Made an impact.
I guess it goes back to that thing of transporting designers into different sort of regions, and it really feels like the London girls sort of doing their thing, and it really stands out in the landscape of New York. I think that it felt very joyous and very kind of like London club scene, and you know, from the music to the the hoodies, the printed sweatshirts, the oversized jeans, the punk hair. I loved it, and it was. You remember sort of when Luella was designing first time around, and she would knock out these sort of killer pieces that became cult items when we were all buying them with our sort of student loans and eating baked beans for a week so we could buy her sort of key jeans, and it feels like it's got that kind of excitement behind it again. I think
it's really interesting, isn't it, as well, because when we did the panel about it, we talked a lot about graphics and about like really, really great and these kind of pieces that, they're very kind of led by that kind of intriguing graphic or intriguing shape, and how if you're a woman who wants to buy that, I think up until now there's been a real focus on you having to buy menswear, or unisex pieces, so buying like, I don't know, like buying Supreme or buying CE or buying Palace or whatever. And it's interesting, I feel, in a way, that kind of cool young girl thing that Luella did, they've kind of developed it in a way, and they're bringing in that shopper who previously perhaps has turned to menswear to get the things that they think are exciting.
There is a boyishness to it.
Yeah, real boyishness.
There's a very kind of tomboy feeling to it, and that, which is, for me, it's very much my favourite bit of Luella, which was the very early Luella, which was, very much referencing the 80s, new wave, Daddy, who were the Clash, Dial F for Flora, Looking Hard in the Yard. It's that kind of era of Luella that it's, I don't want to say too much that it's referencing, but I think she's drawing on things that she drew back then, which, as you were saying, is kind of London subcultures and things like that. And I think, the really great thing is just giving it an identity, and the fact that Marc Jacobs as a man and as a company have the confidence to let it be its own thing, and not, there isn't a single reference to the main line in this. There is, there's no connection between this and the main line. It's entirely its own entity, and there's no connection between this and the main line last season. Or, there's nothing like that. It's becoming its own, completely its own thing. And I think that's what's kind of great and what's exciting about it. And that's why you're actually excited to go and see the show, because it is about this kind of individual creative statement now. But at the same time, there is that accessibility, which is wonderful. The fact that you look at it and nothing's going to cost an absolute fortune, and again, there are pieces that you want to have, and maybe it's a bit more of a shopping show than other shows, because it has that relatability, that immediate relatability, and it's not precious, which I think is great. It's very much, which again is very much a London thing. There's nothing precious about it whatsoever.
Maybe that's a bit what I was getting at with the menswear thing, is I feel like it caters to that girl who doesn't want clothes that feel like they should be kept in a garment bag, and I feel like
you want clothes to go to the pub in, you want clothes to go and see your favourite bands.
The thing I loved about this kind of silk section here is that it's lining fabric.
Yeah,
you know, and there was lots of that. There was lots of lining fabrics, and also I think, you know, we've talked. I was just talking about it. People really London, and that's actually really Stephen Sprouse. So it's very that, you know, there's lots of these kind of cross-cultural references, and they were, you know, Sprouse was something that Llewellyn's always referenced. Yeah. So it's very much speaking this sort of language that I'm familiar with, and it's something that I've sort of missed. I've missed that approach and that kind of irreverence and really what she represents as a designer, and I think it's really satisfying to see it back.
It's incredibly youthful as well. It's not like they've sort of tried to grow up and they're now designing for the Llewellyn girl that has now grown up. They're designing for that original, you know, that Marc Jacobs. That, you know, it's that younger kind of generation, and that's really exciting about it. And I really like the feminine elements of it too. That oversized polka dot, the ruffle skirts, the kind of, you know, that sort of.
But I like the roughness, you know, because the polka dot, it's latex and the polka dots are spray painted on, you know, and the checks are spray painted on. It's, you know, there is that.
It's clever, yeah.
And let's compare this to the Marc Jacobs show. What did we think of that big pink house?
I liked the military elements of it. I thought that worked pretty well. I mean, you can see there was I think there was a coat earlier on, like a navy, sort of, you can imagine like a commander wearing it. I immediately saw that and thought, yeah, I think it's this one, this navy one. Just loved that.
And I thought I found it quite witty, that military element as well, this idea of like taking one of like the most overused references in fashion, just being like, I'm only going to do this, you know, it's all just going to be military. I just thought that was quite funny.
Yeah, but it's kind of oversized and it's different. It's kind of a bit more progressive than just standard military, you know, like with the box pleat pockets and the epaulettes. It's got a bit more punch to it.
No,
I think he really sort of set the tone last season when he, you know, sent down all that delicious dove grey cashmere that was very kind of, you know, it's a real statement about sort of starting from a clean slate. And it feels like the next extension of that. Really, it's still very Spartan. It's very pared back. It's, you know, it's very clean. There's no sort of jet beading and brocading and anything that we might have seen him use before. And it's I think it's quite a statement on this idea of uniform dressing that you know, we've become so entrenched in, that the most sort of simple ideas are kind of what's relevant right now.
Yeah, that's interesting, this notion of simple ideas, simple clothes, but done.
I felt like the beginning bit of it was much more successful than towards the end. I felt it became a bit comical. Kind of reminded me of I mean, I love Grace and Perry, but it immediately made me think of that sort of big silhouette and quite, you know, the big buttons. And
I found the raised polka dot quite disturbing. Cool. I don't know why, there was something quite like,
this is beautiful, like that. Is that a jumpsuit in the middle?
What did you think about Alex for staying quiet?
I think there's a lot going on in it. The thing, the more that I looked at it, and I looked at it as kind of individual pieces as well, and I think there's a hell of a lot going on. And there's a lot of references, some of which are a little bit uncomfortable, you know, like the idea of doing a military collection and then kind of peppering it with holes, I thought was very interesting. Like, it was like kind of cartoon gunshot wounds. And the raised polka dots, which were like bullets. There was actually quite a lot of darkness. I think you look at it and maybe it seems very sort of flat and simple.
Well, it's like cartoon darkness,
and it's mash. But I still think there's a darkness to it. I think there's something that's kind of sinister and a little bit off to a lot of it. And I like it when Marc Jacobs plays with those elements. Like last season, I think there's always a certain darkness to it. You know, for instance, when he did the sort of one of my favourite collections he ever did was the polka dot fetish collection. That, you know, there was such darkness to that. And actually, this I think maybe is a little bit more sort of twisted, and you don't really want to relate it to so much to what's going on in the world, because what happened after this. But I think it's interesting to come out with a military collection when there's so much dissent brewing, when there's so much military action beginning to happen in Syria, in the Middle East. And that's relating, you know, for instance, when you saw Comme des Garçons, there was no way that I couldn't relate Comme des Garçons to that. And even though war had been declared officially the day before, obviously it wasn't a direct result of that, but it was brewed in that crucible.
Yeah,
I feel the same with this as well. I think Marc Jacobs really doesn't get credit for that he really does tap into what's going on in culture, you know, in a wider sphere. You look at grunge and look at the impact that grunge had and how much that was about tapping into all of those different elements.
Yeah.
And I feel the same with other collections. There, you know, there have been moments when he tapped in, for instance, when he did the Marc Jacobs collection that was very 80s and the Louis Vuitton collection that was very Christian Lacroix at a time when the markets were crashing. It was very interesting that he was looking at Lacroix, that first Lacroix collection, which was dancing on the lip of the volcano of the 80s financial crisis. So there's something prescient. He's, you know, he is plugged into all of those kind of things.
Yeah, it's interesting because this season I feel like the show that got related like the most to what's going on in the world in a really sad way, and it goes back to everything we were saying about immediate visual impact and people kind of picking up on digital images really quickly, was the Chanel show, obviously, and everyone kind of like looked at it and was like, oh, isn't fashion stupid, you know, kind of doing this while this is happening in the world. But yeah, it's interesting to talk about that in the context of Con and Marc Jacobs, because I feel like I
did think that Chanel thing was stupid.
Yeah, it was incredibly stupid, and I think that's what the shame was, because I feel like this season there were shows that really did kind of, perhaps not as you implied, perhaps didn't sort of directly respond immediately to what's happening at the moment, because how could they, because they were produced earlier, but definitely said something or came from a mood of,
it's like the other thing that it reminded me of actually was after September the 11th, the spring summer 2002 collections, there was a lot of military, and some designers completely ditched their collections and redid them. I think Tom Ford ditched his Gucci collection and redid it because it was military, and John Galliano showed a military Dior collection and got heavily criticised for showing a Middle Eastern military-inspired collection that had been brewed out of all of that happening, and he didn't want to change what he was doing. Whereas some other designers who were doing military decided to, and it was very interesting that all these designers were doing it when this was happening, or not knowing that this was going to happen.
Yeah, we have an amazing project on SHOWstudio called Killed, which is, you know about this, which is all the kind of 9/11, lots of fashion content and stories that got killed because of 9/11, which is very interesting. Have a look. SHOWstudio there. There's a lot we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about Jason Wu, we haven't talked about Rodarte. Are there any highlights that we should have mentioned? Any other stuff that...
Those two, Jason Wu for me personally was a highlight. I love what he did. And Rodarte was a highlight just in general. Just thought it was the opposite of things that I wear, but I just loved its sort of mishmash mermaid, sort of recycled vibe. I just thought that was so brilliant. Yeah. Just so beautiful, the colours, the iridescence, everything. Just, yeah, I loved that.
I loved the row and the idea of this kind of very controlled environment that had absolutely no theatrics at all, and not even one light bulb. It was just shown under sort of natural light and in concrete. And I think if you're talking about the idea of someone like Jeremy Scott being a brand and it's so loud and sort of obvious, the idea of looking at the row is the best exercise in branding. Every tiny little minute detail is considered. Exactly, every sort of all the fabrics that they use are absolutely exquisite, the finishing and the ideas behind it, and it just, that felt like a perfect exercise in clothes that are entirely wearable but are pushing boundaries in terms of the fabrications that they used. It's not, you don't look at it and think it's wildly conceptual, but actually the way that some of those pieces were working in the showroom, if all the sort of wraps and binding, you know, they're really sort of multi-functional pieces, and they're so beautifully made. I thought that show was lovely.
I find it interesting that it's coming out of Mary-Kate and Ashley as well.
Isn't it just?
And but also with Victoria Beckham, this idea of that, in a weird way, just because somebody hasn't trained formally as a fashion designer doesn't mean they can't kind of make good clothes.
Do you think it's clothes, not fashion? You always talk about this.
I think, I mean, the way that I look at Victoria Beckham, for instance, is it's very much about this kind of a shopping experience. It's very much, you know, Victoria Beckham, what I said about this was she's not trained as a fashion designer, she's trained as a shopper. And basically what she's doing is mixing together these different elements from other collections into an incredibly palatable whole. But on the other side, there's a lot of other designers doing that. There's a lot of other designers that went to fashion school who are lauded for doing that. And I think what she does is incredibly clever, because really it's about satisfying people. That's really what she's doing. And I think that's more clothing than fashion, because she's not looking to push it on. She's not trying to reinvent the wheel. She's trying to make some really good clothes.
It's interesting because even some of the designers who do really push it on, that is their skill, looking at other collections and referencing really well. Like Phoebe Philo, that's exactly what her skill is. And I think that's quite interesting, that notion of what makes someone a good designer. Is it an eye for other things? Is it an ability to kind of, I feel like at the moment we're in a climate where lots of the best designers are the ones that are really good at kind of pulling things together.
Well, I think with someone like Victoria Beckham, the case is having an excellent team of designers around you as well that can execute those things. And I think what becomes interesting in certain, you see it in the big design houses, but also under unnamed designers, is when they're second in command and there's movement, things start to become a little derivative between designers as those people who are actually executing the collections move around as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's talking about this kind of who's designing what, because it's an interesting time at the moment, because there's lots of movement, and we were just chatting before about Oscar de la Renta. What does everyone think about that, about the people being appointed?
I think it's a good fit. I mean, I really like, when we ran the news this morning, what we focused on was the fact that Oscar wants to do it now, and he's really wants to, you know, be clever. And he said, you know, that the industry has often made mistakes where it's sort of let things go too late, and then the brand completely loses its direction and its aesthetic and any sort of common thread. Whereas what he's doing is bringing copying in now, and he wants to sort of build it around him. And help him, and sort of, so when he eventually steps down, it continues in a similar vein, and I think that's a really nice element. And also, I really like that he said that they both like gardening. That's a really sweet comment, and and then obviously the Guillaume Henri at Nina Ricci is that's a great fit too. It's
That'll
like a
be really
happy merry-go-round.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting when it's the actual founding designer selecting who he wants to bring in, because it's you know, for instance, Saint Laurent chose Alber Elbaz to design his women's wear and chose Eddie to do the menswear. You know, so neither of which you could say are bad designers. That's, you know, the whole thing. It's like, and actually having, and with Maria Grazia Chiuri and Pierpaolo Piccioli at Valentino, that was Mr. Valentino's choice of who he wanted to continue. So I think it's that kind of endorsement and the idea of working backwards and forwards together, particularly now because Peter Copping is going to be reporting to Oscar de la Renta. Oscar de la Renta is going to be his boss. But no, bringing him in now rather than at a time when he has to be brought in.
Well, you get rid of that damned if you don't, damned if you do thing, where you're kind of like, are you going to reference the house, are you going to do anything? It kind of just melts away all of those usual difficulties.
And it doesn't have to be a big sort of, you know, animosity, sort of change in direction, big dramatic thing. Like sometimes it can just be sensible, let's do what makes sense. Yeah. And to me it does make great sense.
And it seems like it might be a little bit more forgiving in terms of how it's accepted, in that when a designer steps into, you know, a new house, they expect that first collection to be the answer to everything that came before, and actually it takes time, and they have to get into the swing of, you know, working in a different way with different design teams, using different factories, looking at different archives and understanding the house. And it's not something that you can deliver in, you know, 3 short months. Yeah, exactly. It has to be this period of progression, so it makes sense to do it that way.
Yeah, no, it does make sense, and it kind of, there's kind of a niceness to it. You don't look at them and feel sorry for them, and I think that's a horrible thing to come out of fashion at the moment. Often when designers appointed someone, you just kind of feel bad for them because of all the pressure that's going to come with it. Was this a strong season then? It's interesting because it's thrown up a lot of discussion kind of about what shows should be, and about people kind of, as we've said, you know, doing themselves and et cetera, but was it a strong season despite all those things?
As a whole or as New York?
Both.
Yes and no.
To which and which?
I think it was quite a strong season as a whole. I don't think it was a strong New York season.
Why not for New York? Just too much repetitive?
Because very little of it was memorable.
I think the thing with New York as well is that you see it the first time around, and then you get within the framework of the whole month, and then you sort of go back and pick out the bits that are relevant, and actually, like you say, there doesn't seem to be that much filtering to the top in the mix.
The thing I find interesting about it as a season was, and actually I think you said something, and this is a bit of a contradiction, but I found it incredibly easy to tick trends off. I was literally like, there's almost too many, because last season I had trouble finding 4. Whereas this season I'm like, okay, great, so, you know, Oriental, Gingham, Lilac, 70s, flare trousers, denim. Like literally, you would almost I was like, okay, so I've got 15. That's a bit too many.
But I didn't find that necessarily, you know, all those notes go down. But I think it's when you move on to, you know, Milan and then obviously Paris that those start to solidify. I don't find that necessarily there was, apart from gingham maybe, as you say, that anything was sort of really leaping out. It still seems to be an overwhelming amount of kind of elevated sportswear, and that doesn't seem to be going anywhere, which is what New York does.
Okay. Strong season for New York?
I think the thing with New York, which always stands out, as we've discussed, there's always like those 5 big shows.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was any different this season. They all delivered, they all, you know, stood out. It's sort of, I mean, New York is such a busy schedule as well. It sort of is a bit of a shame that there's so many hundreds of shows.
Do you think it's a busy schedule? Because I always, when I speak to my friends who go out to New York, because I don't do the New York.
I mean, it's a long schedule.
Yeah, they always like have these like huge gaps in the day where they're like.
But it depends on the different demands. I think if you're going with advertising demands, when I went with specific advertising demands, it was much busier than when I go now, because now I go and it's much more cherry picking. You know, what I want to see, when I want to see. You know, it's. I think it is that. I do feel like you could possibly condense it down, but then already there are so many shows on it. There's just shows that we don't go to. There's shows you don't even know about. Like I didn't know Adam Selman, who dressed Rihanna for the CFDAs, I didn't even know he was having a show until I saw people tweeting about it. And then I felt, well, I should have been at that show. I had no idea it was going on.
It does feel like there still needs to be a bit more of an umbrella approach to the schedule, to off-season, to presentation, because there's so much that happens off that main Mercedes-Benz schedule as well, you know, and all those presentations of Rosie Asseline and Adam Lippes and Issa Arfin and all these kind of new exciting people that you don't want to miss, that you can fit in between if you sort of map it out.
I think that will be different from next season though, isn't it? Won't it even? Because I think the CFDA has brought in
it was supposed
the fashion
to be now, I think.
Was it? I thought it was next season.
Yeah, but it
so maybe next season they'll have hit their stride a bit better.
Yeah, because I always feel like New York, there is exciting kind of young, interesting talent, and it does just kind of get missed and overlooked in a way that we just don't allow to happen in London. You know, we're really like pushing our young guys forward.
Because the Parsons MFA is a perfect example of that. If we think about in London, the Central St Martin's BA show is one that nobody misses.
And LCF now as well doing their show, and it's off schedule. But
and Fashionista and all these sort of encouraging new gen everything. I don't know, I feel like that's sort of missing a little bit. Like the Parsons MFA, I looked through and I thought some of those pieces were great.
The CFDA are turning their Vogue Fashion Fund into a television series, so that will be gracing our screens soon, so that might give a bit more emphasis to that.
Well, shall we give them a clap then for providing us with food for discussion? And I think a big clap should go to some of the standout ones that we spent a long time talking about, like people like Tom Brown, and I guess also Luella and Katie and Marc. So should we give New York a clap for keeping us entertained?